As many of you know, this season's subject is introductions. Brand new artists, well, not obviously new. Modotti was born in the 19th century, but artists that are unfamiliar to most contemporary audiences. Now, Tina Modotti's achievements as a modernist photographer in Mexico are all the more impressive when we consider how very brief her career was, roughly 7 years. Yes, she died young at the age of 45, but by that time she had given up photography for more than a decade. Who was Tina Modotti? How did she have such an impact in such a short time? And why did she give it all up? Those are the questions I will be addressing today. Tina Modotti was born in Udine in 1896 in the northeast corner of Italy, and she grew up speaking Friulian, a dialect of Italian. Then, from the age of 2 to 9, she lived in Austria, where her family had moved for work opportunities for her father. And when they returned to Friuli, she was placed in remedial classes because she didn't read or write standard Italian. This gave her a lifelong inferiority complex about her own intellectual abilities, when actually she had a wide-ranging intelligence and would go on to speak several languages fluently. Her father was a skilled machinist, politically active in the labor movement, which meant that many employers were leery of hiring him. So in order to find work, he emigrated to San Francisco when Modotti was 12 years old. And her family struggled financially without their father on hand. So 2 years later, at 14, she went to work in a silk spinning factory. That was something that teenage girls with their nimble fingers were very good at, but it was grueling work. So she knew child labor firsthand from her own labor. Her father sent first for her eldest sister, and then for her next sister, and finally, in 1913, he sent for 16-year-old Tina. So she came to San Francisco and she discovered an affinity for the arts. She got involved in the amateur Italian-American theater scene and became a popular actress in that community. And she met a young man born Ruby Ritchie on a ranch in Oregon. But he found that background a little too pedestrian for his artistic desires, and so he began to style himself Roubaix de l'Abri Richer. And he was an artist and a textile designer. He was particularly interested in batik. And so the two of them became a couple. And in 1919, they moved to Los Angeles. D.W. Griffith had come to San Francisco looking for talent for silent movies. Tina wished to give that a try. So there was a flourishing arts community in Los Angeles that Modotti and Richer, who by this time is calling himself French-Canadian, if not just French, they inserted themselves in. You can see they were featured in this Southern California publication in 1921 as interior decorators, designers. We see Ritchie sketching and Modotti working on a dress. She was an excellent seamstress, and did you know that silent movie actresses had to furnish their own wardrobes. Well, Modotti's was particularly interesting and dramatic because of her skills, and she was cast in several silent films, mostly in supporting roles, and in one starring role, The Tiger's Coat in 1920. But being a dark-complexioned beauty from Italy, she was always given femme fatale roles, cast as the evil temptress figure. So she blossomed in this milieu of actors, writers, artists, and photographers of Southern California in this period right after the end of World War I. And among the striving, intoxicating people she met was the photographer Edward Weston. Now, at this time, Weston was a pictorialist photographer, and pictorialism was a movement that used soft focus and blurry, gauzy effects to mimic the look of Impressionist paintings. Pictorialist photographers wanted photographs to be accepted as works of high art, not just replicating mechanically the everyday world. And so they had these self-consciously arty effects. And this Weston photograph of Tina Modotti sniffing a white iris is a textbook example of pictorialist style. However, before long, Weston would travel to New York City, where he met Alfred Stieglitz, who was the great tastemaker of American photography, and Charles Sheeler, a precisionist photographer, which is precisionism is essentially the exact opposite of pictorialism. And they convinced Weston that the proper use of a camera was not pictorialist fuzziness, but sharp focus, what a camera does better than the human eye, capturing the details of the natural world. Other friends of theirs, like Johann Hagemeyer, who photographed Modotti in 1921, were already moving in this direction, away from pictorialism and into what they called straight photography. Weston rarely photographed a beautiful woman that he did not wish to sleep with. And before long, he and Tina were embarked on an affair. And at the end of 1921, Richer decided to move to Mexico City. And he went with a portfolio of Weston prints, hoping to gain a following there for Weston, who we think, unbeknownst to Richer, was his wife's lover. Richer wrote to Weston that Mexico City was an artist's paradise, and he wrote many imploring letters to Tina asking her to join him in Mexico, but she kept putting him off. She was having a lot of fun in California. She had this film project or that one, and yes, she was still involved in this hot and heavy affair with Edward Weston, who here photographs her in a sort of transitional photograph. It's not yet hard focus, but it's not nearly as gauzy as the pictorialist works. So she stalled, but eventually she bought a train ticket and packed her bags and was about to get on the train when on February 3rd, she received this telegram. Have smallpox, light form, return home. And she did not return home. She made the 3-day train journey to Mexico City. She wanted to be by his side through this terrible illness, and got off the train in Mexico City, and a few hours later, Richie died. Tina was struck with tremendous remorse, having dallied in California with her lover rather than traveling to Mexico, where she felt somehow she could have prevented his death. She staged an exhibition in Mexico City of his work. She compiled this Book of Robo, their nickname for him, of his drawings and writings and poetry. And although there is no archival evidence suggesting that they were legally married, although she called herself Mrs. Richer, she would remain in touch with her mother-in-law, Richer's mother, for the rest of her life. So she did, however, fall in love with Mexico City. And when she returned to Southern California, she persuaded Weston that they should open a photographic studio in Mexico City. She drew up a contract. She would manage the studio, she would manage all of the financial transactions, she would arrange exhibitions, all of this in exchange for lessons in photography from a master. She wanted a career that would give her independence. Her uncle in Udine had a photographic studio, and it's thought she helped out there as a teenager. She also had a lot of experience on the other side of the lens, but she chose to train as a photographer with Weston. So the two of them, plus Weston's eldest son, Chandler, and another boy Chandler's age, who was also apprenticing in photography, they all left for Mexico together. And Weston's wife stayed at home with their other 3 sons, calling out to Tina as they departed, "Take care of my boys." So we don't know exactly how Weston trained Modotti, but we know how he trained a later apprentice/lover. He made her go for several months composing images on the ground glass of the viewfinder with no film in her camera. And only when Weston, checking her work, was convinced that she had learned to see the world in black and white and shades of gray and compose interesting images on that viewfinder, was she allowed to create photographs. So these are a couple of early ones that Modotti made of Weston. This one as Weston as the almost a silent film director type, very stagey and dramatic. Tina herself would never dress as flamboyantly as she had before Richer's death. She became, she sort of put on widow's weeds. So she begins to photograph, we begin to have her work starting in 1924. And one of her early works is this image of a marionette and its shadow that she called My Latest Lover. Now, it's a charming photograph, but it also, and whimsically titled, of course, but it also points out an issue that was causing fractures in Modotti and Weston's relationship. That is, that she wished to claim for herself the same degree of sexual freedom that he enjoyed. But he suffered tremendous bouts of jealousy if she showed any interest in another man or vice versa. So this would be an ongoing problem in their relationship. They would go out and photograph often together, training their cameras on the same subject matter. So they went to the circus, and Weston photographed the circus tent in a way that is almost abstract, where if we didn't have the title of this work, we might not understand what we were looking at. It's an arresting image of angles, of darks and lights and patterns, but Tina included the bleachers and a few spectators. So she grounds the image, whereas Weston's work tends towards the abstract and impersonal. Modotti's tends to have a human element. Not always. So for instance, she made this photograph of the interior of a church tower at Tepoztlan that is extremely abstract. And then when she had the opportunity to show this work, she printed it and then mounted it upside down. And Weston wrote in his day books, quote, I myself would have been pleased to have done it. In truth, it may not be the best usage of photography, but it is very genuine, and one feels no striving, no sweat, as in the Man Ray experiments, end quote. So Weston was suspicious of trick effects of artists like Man Ray, but felt this was an image turned upside down he would have been proud to make. Here, Modotti photographs a bare tree with a really interesting pattern of shade, with these dark areas of ground, cropping the apex of that tree, but she adds canine, if not human interest, by including the dog at the base of the tree. She would photograph their maid, Eliza. Now, while Modotti was running the studio, she refused to do all the cooking and cleaning. So they hired this young woman who had a childhood injury that left her right hand permanently contracted. So we can see that claw-like hand in the image and a somewhat forlorn look on the young woman's face, but it's not a sentimentalizing image. Neither is her photograph of roses, which is also nearly abstract, kind of swirling effect of the patterns of petals, but we know roses well enough to recognize that there are 4 blooms here, and you can't make an image of roses without alluding to that flower's history as a symbol of romantic love. In fact, in August of 1924, on the occasion of their 1-year anniversary in Mexico, Weston and Modotti went to a hack portrait photographer and had cheesy anniversary portraits made of themselves. So Weston found it hilarious that the photographer posed them with, as he put it, a dusty, dirty bunch of roses. And Modotti puckishly suggested, oh, my husband is very religious. Perhaps you can use a church in the background. So another one has them standing in front of a backdrop of a cathedral. They were both atheists, so they thought this was hysterical. For Weston, it was a lark that he wrote about in his day books, but we wonder if this gesture might have had more significance to Modotti, whom Weston continued to photograph. But look how much his style has evolved from that very blurred white iris of just 3 years earlier to this much sharper focused image where we see the shadow of her eyelashes. He often caught her in anguish. Another photograph is called Tina with Tear, that's visible on her cheek because they had such a tempestuous relationship. They were often fighting, but she was learning and experimenting to get a sense of the range of what a camera could do, which included double exposures. So this is a double exposure, one image with these are the same glasses, but she's closer in one. You can see the larger circular forms, farther away for the smaller circular forms, but they meet in a central stem, but another nearly abstract image. Her open doors gives us a sense of her interest in zigzagging composition, but also suggests some interest in the lives of the people that lie beyond such doors. And her telephone wires had her taking her camera into the city and aiming it with her tripod at the sky, giving us this almost abstract image that nevertheless suggests the multitudes of messages of human communications that traveled on those slender wires that branch out in every direction. When she photographed objects in the natural world, she's often playing with form and abstraction. Here, a cactus positioned to look like a heart, or here, a homely, straggly geranium, an absolutely individual plant, not an iconic, perfect geranium at all, in an almost comically chipped and broken pot. So she's learning to see and focus on things and developing her own unique pictorial language that sometimes involves puns. So just as you can't photograph roses without romance, you can't photograph an Easter lily with all sorts of religious connotations coming to mind. In the whole history of Christian art, the angel Gabriel arrives at the scene of the Annunciation to tell the Virgin Mary that she's pregnant, bearing just such a lily as this one. And Modotti plays with the idea of insemination by placing that bud at the convergence of the opening petals. So it's a very suggestive image, which well may have inspired later works by Weston, like his shell, his nautilus shell. Weston's interest in still life is formed in Mexico through his association with Modotti. And when a couple of years later, he sent this print to Mexico, when he was working in Northern California by that time, he professed great surprise that Modotti found this mysterious and erotic. And Weston professed to be shocked when Diego Rivera looked at it and asked if Weston were oversexed. For Weston, this is not supposed to refer to a phallus. No, this is a pure nautilus form that required a 3-hour exposure to get this image just right. So Weston was professing that everything needed to be in the image itself, that we weren't meant to refer to things outside of the frame, with a purity of vision that asks us to look at this image strictly in terms of its beautiful curves, its shining surfaces, the pattern of the tile, not to think of this as an object that one pees into. Even when Modotti is making exercises in form, she always includes something human or personal. So here again, that interest in a zigzag composition, but she chooses just this particular spot to photograph because I think of that line of straggly plants that goes around the, let me see if I have my, yes, that line of straggly plants, like that geranium that forms one of the angles of her zigzag. At the very end of 1924, Weston and his son and the friend returned to Los Angeles, not just to be with his wife and other sons, but there was another woman there as well. But he left the studio in the very capable hands of Modotti. Weston believed her apprenticeship to be over, that she was fully able to function as an independent photographer. So she took on all of their portrait commissions. She continued to print the images that Weston had made in Mexico. She took new portrait commissions, like this one of Maria Marin de Orozco, who was someone that Modotti met through her interest in leftist politics. So Weston was apolitical, but Modotti had socialism as her birthright through her father's involvement in the labor movement. And she met many members of the Communist Party, became involved in International Red Aid, which was like a Red Cross for communists, helping victims of political oppression. But she wasn't able to make as much photography as she would have liked. So she wrote Weston, quote, "I cannot, as you once proposed to me, solve the problem of life by losing myself in the problem of art. In my case, life is always striving to predominate, and art naturally suffers. I put too much art in my life, and consequently, I have not much left to give to art," end quote. So she maintained the studio, but was so involved with politics that she wasn't making much work. And she was meeting not just politicians, but the members of the Communist Party included major members of the Mexican mural movement: Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros. She also began to pose for Diego Rivera. This is a project Rivera was doing in 1927, where a monastery, a former monastery, was being converted into an agricultural college. And Rivera was given the chapel to transform into what he called a secular Sistine chapel. And the figure, the allegory of the fertility of Mexico, is based on Rivera's wife, Lupe Marin, but Modotti began to pose for Rivera as well. These are studies that he made of her on the left, and a fresco from that chapel's decoration on the right. And Rivera was, if anything, an even bigger womanizer than Weston. So they became involved. Lupe Marin would cite their relationship in her divorce papers about a year later. But not only was Tina posing for the Mexican muralists, she was also photographing their work. And that was hugely important because there was tremendous international interest in the Mexican muralist movement. Rivera was an internationally famous artist, but most art lovers weren't coming to see his frescoes in Mexico City. So photographs became the major means of dissemination of his work. So here, Modotti photographing, again, the Chapingo Chapel, photographing a work that she herself had posed for. Here, she's photographing his Festival of the Tractor from a government building in Mexico City. And most art historians have ignored this part of Modotti's output, considering these just documents of the work of another great artist. But many of them are works of art in their own right. In August 1925, Weston returned to Mexico City. So again, he and Modotti were living under the same roof, although she always kept her own bedroom, photographing together, as we see here, where they are focusing their attention on pulquerias, popular locales for drinking the alcoholic beverage pulque. Which were brightly decorated with folk art. And there was an intense interest in Mexican popular art, self-taught art, in this period. And Modotti and Weston were asked by Anita Brenner, whom Modotti would photograph in these rather gender-bending ways, and Weston would photograph in the nude, to do a series of 400 photographs of Mexican folk art, from pre-Columbian to contemporary handicrafts, to illustrate Brenner's book, Idols Behind Altars, which was finally published in 1927. So this time accompanied by Weston's second oldest son, Brett, Modotti and Weston crisscrossed Mexico on a very tight budget to make these 400 images, images which Modotti was still printing in 1927. Both artists are credited in the book. So, although that interest in folk art was also linked to the aims of the Communist Party, for Weston it was purely aesthetic. And it is in this project, this Idols project, that Weston achieves the hard-edged, beautifully composed modernist aesthetic that would make him famous. This has been called a seminal image within Weston's oeuvre, this tres ollas, 3 pots, so tightly arranged and beautifully shot. And Modotti, too, was photographing ollas, but hers is on the back of a woman carrying it. Increasingly, Modotti's work would focus on work. In 1926, she made this pivotal work in her career, Workers' Parade, which she made from a rooftop, looking down on all of these workers who had amassed. And it's blurry because of the technology she is using at the time. She didn't have really high speed film, stop motion camera, but that blurriness also gives it the sense of fluidity, as if this is a kind of a sea of sombreros that is fluctuating here. These workers united by their common costume, none of them individually identifiable, but all of them together creating a mighty force, as well as an interesting pattern across the picture plane. Modotti might photograph a cornfield with the same overall, almost abstract patterning, but of course she's also referring to an essential food staple within Mexican culture and to the labor that tended and produced these healthy plants. So she's increasingly focused on labor. Not that that had been absent from her earlier work. This is a photo of workers from her apprenticeship in 1924, but from 1926 onwards, as her commitment to communism increases, so does her commitment to photographing working people. Like this, a man with an enormous load of straw strapped to his back, so high that he can pin his sombrero to it, a man that has become a beast of burden, or this man hauling a huge load of pallets. We get a sense of the strength of these people and the heaviness of their loads. And this marvelous effect of diagonals against a more rectilinear grid is repeated in her oil tank of 1927, a much more industrialized image. Now, Mexico wanted to modernize and industrialize, but Modotti suggests that would lead to even greater dehumanization of the individual worker, who is dwarfed here by the tank and the ladder. She was also very interested in women's labor and in racism. So this Aztec mother is made by Modotti, who's very aware that in Mexican society of the 1920s, skin color was destiny. The darker your skin was, the more indigenous heritage you had, the more likely you were to be extremely poor, to be an unskilled laborer. The lighter your skin, the more European ancestry you could claim, the more likely you were to be educated and to have a white-collar position. And Modotti is very aware of that and using the dark-light contrast of black and white photography to comment on it. Her Aztec baby shows an infant nursing, another realm of women's work and responsibility. And this is a marvelously unsentimental image of this basic act of childcare. In another image of women's labor, Modotti focuses in on just the hands of a washerwoman. We see the dark skin, the whiteness of the cloth, and the suds in the foreground, slightly out of focus. Now, at the end of the Idols Behind Altars project, Weston had returned to California, never to return. Their relationship was over. And these images that she is making are going off in a very different direction, a much more political one than Weston would have sanctioned. So now she's completely independent and making images that appeal to her own morality. Here, hands resting on a tool. So Modotti's work was being published both in international art and photography journals and in communist publications. So this appeared in a German photography publication, but also in a Mexican communist one with the caption, "We are building a better world." So these are images that can be politicized, that have the possibility of becoming propaganda. And some of her images are overtly propagandistic. This was made about the time Modotti officially joined the Mexican Communist Party in 1927. So it shows corn, that staple food of Mexico, a bandolier, a symbol of the Mexican Revolution, and the sickle, that emblem of international communism. So this is a still life created, not found, but created by Modotti for a political purpose. She would focus on a worker reading El Machete, which was the Communist Party newspaper in Mexico City, a paper which was founded by Siqueiros and Javier Guerrero, an artist, Guerrero, who was exactly her age, born in 1896, but who had a more purely didactic purpose behind his art making. It was utterly in the service of communism. So we see that portrait of him made by Modotti at the upper left, at the right, published in El Machete, one of his woodcuts, where the banner says, "After so many years of war, the earth needs those who work with their hands." And it features the hammer and the sickle, overt propaganda. Guerrero and Modotti became lovers in 1927 until at the end of the year he was given a fellowship to study in Moscow to learn Soviet propaganda from the source. So they said their farewells, but Modotti continued her involvement with the Mexican Communist Party and became very close with a younger party member, Julio Antonio Mella from Cuba, who was very impressed with her work and its possibilities for propaganda. So Modotti was now the de facto photographer of the Mexican Communist Party. Whenever there was a workers' rally or a committee meeting or a reception at the Soviet embassy, Modotti was there to chronicle it. And she continued to make her own photography, but concentrating on images that had a possibility of being politicized. For instance, this woman with a flag would be used as a kind of icon of communism, here published on the cover of a German publication, Red World Army. Here she focuses her attention on a working woman doing laundry in front of a doorway with 4 children, on the grinding poverty that the working classes in Mexico had to live with. Here, she photographs a family, Miguel Delgado and his family, in front of their entire corn harvest spread out before them, and it isn't, it looks kind of abundant, but it's thin. It isn't much. Or here, a Mexican woman selling cabbages. And again, you will see how Modotti's camera captures the very dark skin of the indigenous urban poor who are forced to do the most grinding labor. Now, she didn't actually come across this forlorn worker lounging underneath the tuxedo ad. This is the only photo montage in her career. So she separately photographed the foreground and the billboard, and then collaged them together and re-photographed it to create this seamless image. But this is the kind of thing that Maya, who had been evicted from Cuba for his activities in the Communist Party there, felt could be important works of propaganda. Not only did Modotti's friendship with Diego Rivera break up his marriage, but around 1928, she was also becoming friendly with a young artist named Frida Kahlo. And the two of them would appear in Rivera's mural, The Arsenal, which is in the Ministry of Education in Mexico City, this scene of the distribution of arms, where Frida is right in the center with the red star on her breast, handing out bayonet tips in the Ministry of Education. Rivera depicts Frida, his new love, at the center, and Modotti, his most recent lover, here at the side, gazing lovingly into the eyes of Juan Antonio Maya. But we also get this figure here who seems to be staring at Modotti, who seems obsessed with Modotti as Modotti is with Maya. That was a man named Vittorio Vidale, and that, like Modotti, he was from northern Italy, had fought the rise of fascism in his native country, then went to Moscow to become a Soviet operative, and ended up in Mexico City. But he will be important later. There seems to be a love triangle here, and Modotti was furious with Diego for spilling her private life on the walls of the Ministry of Education. She would photograph Maya in that beautiful portrait we saw earlier. She would also photograph Maya's typewriter because she believed that this was how revolution spread. This was his most important tool in the furthering of international communism. However, the text is legible, and it's identifiable as a quote by Leon Trotsky. That was dangerous material in 1928, in the Stalin era, and Modotti and Meyer knew it well. It may even have cost Meyer his life, because in January 1929, as he and Modotti were walking home late one night, Meyer was assassinated. A gunman ran up, fired a few shots, and ran away in the fog. And the police immediately arrested Modotti. They dredged up nude photographs Weston had made of her and tried to frame her as a Mata Hari. She was forced to undergo police reconstructions of the crime, and in the end, no one was ever charged. The Mexican Communist Party blamed the reactionary Cuban government, but some felt that the Communist Party itself had silenced Meyer for his pro-Trotsky, anti-party line views. Now, Rivera was a huge supporter of Modotti during her arrest and during her arraignment. We can see that she was back in the swing of things by May, photographing this May Day march, which is the first photograph to depict Frida and Diego side by side. She even hosted their wedding dinner the following month, in June 1929. But the whole Meyer affair was deeply traumatic for Modotti, and she hung her only one-woman show of her lifetime in Mexico City in 1929, and placed the photograph of Meyer at the very top, as if it were a shrine above those strongly propagandistic images. And she had, for herself, a new somberness. It was as if she were again a widow. To heal from this trauma, she went to the Tehuantepec Isthmus, where there was a culture that was matriarchal and very colorful. The women still wore their traditional costume that Rivera would encourage Frida Kahlo to adopt as she created her own persona. And when she returned to Mexico City, Modotti continued to make provocative images that the government then in power found threatening, like this one of not one worker, but multiple workers reading El Machete. Her last major series of photographs in Mexico focused on a young American Russian-born puppeteer who had come to Mexico to do puppet shows for the masses. So she made these striking images of sometimes just the puppet, sometimes just the hands, here both, suggesting that working people, ordinary people, are being controlled by forces beyond their ken. It's capital pulling the strings. Labor is simply dancing to capital's tune. So there's this strong feeling in these beautiful images of the puppeteer and his skill of powerful forces acting on the lower classes. But there were powerful forces acting on Modotti in those years. In 1930, There was an assassination attempt against Mexican President Julio Ortiz Rubio. And again, the police arrested Modotti. She was held incommunicado for 2 weeks in one of the worst prisons in Mexico City, where political prisoners frequently were disappeared. Eventually, she was released, but given 3 days to leave Mexico. She was being expelled. And so she held a fire sale of most of her belongings, and according to different accounts, she either gave or sold one of her cameras to her younger colleague, Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who became an important Mexican modernist photographer. Modotti would be a huge and lasting influence on his work. Modotti herself went to Berlin, and on the boat taking her across the Atlantic, who should appear but Vittorio Vidali, that shadowy figure from the mural. The two of them, perhaps drawn together by their common background in northern Italy, their common interests in the Communist Party, they became a couple and would be for the last dozen years of Modotti's life. In Berlin, she made a few photos like this one, where she set up her tripod outdoors at the zoo, waiting for just the right shot to enter the frame, which it obviously did here. But she found it very dispiriting to work in Berlin. Unlike Mexico City, where there was no progressive photography going on before she and Weston arrived, Berlin had an extremely active avant-garde photographic community with very high levels of technical skill. And she felt like she could not effectively photograph this society in which she was such an outsider. Plus, in Mexico, Modotti had relied entirely on natural light, the strong, brilliant sunlight of that climate. Berlin failed her in that respect. The sunshine was simply, there was not enough light for her to work in the way that she liked. So ultimately, she and Vidali decided to go to the place they felt they could be of most use, which was Moscow. Over the next few years, they worked together for International Red Aid, helping refugees, smuggling funds into Romania. They headed the Parisian Red Aid office from 1933 to 34, and then they returned to Moscow, and in 1936, they were sent to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, where she helped bomb victims and refugees, and probably acted as a spy for the Soviet Secret Service. All this time making, as far as we know, not a single photograph. Vidali was certainly a Soviet operative of the Secret Service. He's credited with some 400 executions of Spanish reactionaries. But we don't know how much Modotti knew about these activities. This period of her life is not at all well documented. After the fall of Madrid in 1939, she escaped over the Pyrenees and tried to enter America with forged papers, but they weren't quite good enough. So she ended up back in Mexico City, where she died in 1942. The death certificate listed her cause of death as congestive heart failure. But nearly everything else on the death certificate was wrong, and so there is suspicion about her cause of death as well. Some believed she'd been eliminated by the Mexican Communist Party, perhaps even by her own lover, Vidali, for knowing too much. The woman who had put too much art in her life, which caused her ultimately to abandon art altogether in favor of service, had nevertheless profoundly affected the future of Mexican photography. She had brought the high standards of modernist picture making to the depiction of everyday Mexican working people, producing images that were both heartfelt and iconic, consistent with her desire to capture arresting images of the world around her, but also to work for what she felt was a better future for all. Thank you. So I have gone a couple of minutes long, and I know some of you may have to escape, but I am happy to take questions or go back to any images you'd like a second look at. Yes? Yes. Does Seattle Art Museum have any Modotti works, and have they ever had an exhibition by her? Not to my knowledge. However, I never go to the Seattle Art Museum website when I'm looking for images for a talk because they don't have high enough resolution images on their website for me to use. So MoMA has beautiful images, and I think that as of January 1st, Modotti's work, because she died in 1942, I believe that Modotti's work is now in the public domain, which means that Wikipedia will begin to have images and so forth. But Sam's website is so dismal that I just don't even use it. So I don't know if there are any Modottis in the Sam collection, but they certainly are not something that have been prominently featured. I suspect there are in Portland. They have a marvelous photography collection, and they have a curator who's very interested in Mexican modernism. So there may be some in Portland. Yes? So, yes, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo were Trotskyites. They even hosted Trotsky in their home, where there was an assassination attempt against Trotsky's life on the Rivera compound. However, Modotti was not as powerful as Diego Rivera. Rivera was an internationally famed artist. The Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the major modern art museum in the world now, but it opened in 1929. It gave its first one-man show to Matisse and its second to Diego Rivera. So that gives you an idea of Rivera's stature in the art world. So to bump off a Diego Rivera would have caused international repercussions, whereas someone like a Maya was not as well connected. And I can't remember the exact chronology, but it was only after Rivera found out that Trotsky was having an affair with Frida Kahlo that he encouraged Trotsky to move out. In other words, sort of he took away that mantle of protection of being hosted by Diego Rivera, and it was after that that Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico City. So yes, but it did not, and by that time, Diego had already been expelled from the Mexican Communist Party. Frida resigned in protest, and so Diego was always kind of a free spirit who couldn't be pinned down. So he wasn't worried about repercussions from the Communist Party. Does that answer? Other questions? Yes? That is a really good question. So Imogen Cunningham, would she have known Modotti? Would they have known each other's work? Imogen Cunningham photographed Frida Kahlo in San Francisco in 1930, as did Edward Weston. Both of them made photographs of Frida in 1930, but by that time, Weston and Modotti had been split for 4 years. So I don't, and Modotti, of course, did not come to San Francisco with Diego and Frida, so I don't know if somehow their work would have met. Certainly they were both, their work was reproduced in international photographic journals. Cunningham was involved in a major German exhibition in the late 1920s, I want to say 1927, where Modotti might have seen her examples of photography in that publication. Cunningham might have seen Modotti's in journals as well, but I don't believe they had any sort of deep knowledge of each other's work. But they both have a connection with Edward Weston. She and Cunningham were never lovers, but they were longtime friends. So it's a very interesting question, and that might be actually a more likely venue for Modotti's work, because I know that Weston was sending her prints in Mexico City, and I believe she was reciprocating. So Cunningham might have seen Modotti's work via Edward Weston in the years after the end of Weston and Modotti's affair. So I don't know for sure, but one can speculate. There are interesting parallels between their work, though. Cunningham was allowed a much longer life, fortunately. So, other questions? Well, is it next month? When do I come back for Carrie? February. 18th? 15th. February 15th, Carrie James Marshall, who is one of our greatest figurative painters, and I think you will enjoy his work a great deal. Thank you so much.